Now the time has come for us to begin. We have a special lecture by the world-renowned media literacy educator, Professor David Buckingham. Professor Buckingham is a respected scholar with extensive research and outstanding contributions to the field of media literacy. He's going to talk about whether or not the essence of media education will change in the age of AI. His lecture will be conducted for about 40 minutes, and if we have time left, perhaps we could have a Q&A session for about 10 minutes or so. So please listen and think about the questions that you want to ask or the comments that you'd like to share during the Q&A session. He'll provide insights on how AI impacts the media landscape and education and the direction it may take in the future. He's joining us right now. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning or good afternoon.
Yes, we can hear you. Good afternoon. And thank you for joining us today in real time. So if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. It is actually about 7:30 in the morning here. Just getting light outside. So good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you. I should also say right at the beginning, in case I forget, thank you also to the translators for making this possible. I'm going to talk about the topic that everybody is talking about, artificial intelligence. And I should make a disclaimer right at the beginning. I am not an AI expert. I'm certainly not a computer scientist. If I know about anything, it's media education, and that's going to be the emphasis here. Okay, good. Yes, so what I want to encourage you to do in a way is to calm down. There's a danger as we talk about this that we all get very overexcited. We tend to panic about the impact of a new technology. So what I want to do is first of all say, calm down. I want to begin by clarifying the terms, clarifying really what are we talking about here. I think the main focus is really on generative AI, and I'm going to explain a bit about that. In English, we have an expression, what do you want to hear first, the good news or the bad news? I'm probably starting with the bad news. So I'm going to talk about some problems that AI will pose, social problems, environmental problems, problems to do with media and information, and also to do with education. And all of this, I think, represents a challenge for us as media educators. So what I will try to do later on is to suggest some ways forward, some ways of teaching critically about AI, but also a possibility that is here, I think, to bring together theory and practice, critical analysis and practical creative production. It's possible that AI may allow for a different kind of creativity in the media classroom. So there's my overview, and hopefully I will do it in 40 minutes. We shall see. I think probably fair to say that we're living in a bit of a science fiction world here. Here we have Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator. I'm sure you're familiar with that. We have a series of magical claims being made about what AI will do. It will generate wealth, it will empower people, it will transform people's everyday lives. And those claims, I think, are not just being made by the technology companies, they're also being made by many politicians as well. And on the other hand, we have a kind of dystopian story that this will be the end of democracy, this will be the end of truth, the machines will take over. The cyborgs are coming. And I think there's always a danger with this, that we get into a kind of media panic. On the one hand, we have a kind of boosterism about the wonders of technology. And on the other hand, we have a story that we're all going to hell as the robots take over. that balance or that awkward combination is very familiar. And I think a lot of it tends to be overstated on both sides of the argument. I think important to say that despite this rhetoric, AI is made by human beings. I, in a way, would question the idea of intelligence here. Is AI intelligent? Are these machines smart machines? Do these machines learn? I'm very dubious about that, really. I think we're talking really about computers bringing about a kind of automated prediction. That's what AI is. So the idea that we're going to have robots that have a kind of sentience and intelligence and that they will gradually take over from human beings, I think is quite questionable. The humans are still in control, but this is a world of private profit. It's driven by the drive for profit. It may be disruptive. It may be a matter of moving fast and breaking things, as the technology magnates tend to say. But actually, it's a world where the imperatives are coming from commercial profit. And as ever, when that is the case, there will be unanticipated consequences. So there are often big claims being made, but actually there will be some things that we had not anticipated at all. And I think this is the case in education as well. We have a very, very long history of big claims being made about technology in education. You go to conferences and what you're told is, look, here there's all this wonderful, cool stuff. Educators and particularly the technology companies selling you cool stuff that will transform your classroom. You know, this picture here, I think probably goes back 40 years. It's early advertising for Apple computers. And we have a history of these kinds of big claims being made about the impact of technology. And really, once we begin to look at it, it's actually a history of failed promises. These big claims really hardly ever come true. So if you think about, it goes back a long way to the beginning of film, but right through now to the metaverse. Remember the metaverse? Remember Google Glass? Remember learning platforms, MOOCs, whiteboards, tablet computers, teaching machines, and so on. A whole succession of new technologies that would allegedly transform education. And really, that's not what happens. What we find, in fact, is that teachers will often take up these technologies. They find them very useful for planning. They're very useful for testing and marking some of the more boring routine aspects of teaching. But actually, the idea that they will create magical new forms of learning is really quite questionable. And the idea, I think, in particular, that they will replace teachers, that we will have kind of robot teachers doing the teacher's job. I think these are claims we have to be very skeptical about. Okay, let's think about how we define what we're talking about here. AI, I would say, is a means of extracting and analyzing data, and on the basis of that, looking for patterns in data, and on the basis of that, making predictions. It's something we're actually very used to already. I think it's probably useful to think in terms of two waves of AI. The first wave, in a sense, is everywhere now. It's ubiquitous. And we're used to AI because it offers us convenience, it's fast. We're used to, you know, when we want to pay our electricity bill and we have a problem, we talk to a bot. we're used to that kind of automated dialogue. We're used to Google and search engines that learn what it is we are likely to be looking for. We're used to Amazon systems of recommendation. We're used to reading reviews online, and those reviews will then send us in search of other things. This kind of micro-targeting, personalization of technology is using forms of AI, and it's very familiar. It's almost so banal that we hardly notice it. But now we're seeing the beginnings of a second wave of AI, what gets called generative AI. So this is AI that is not just about generating recommendations, helping us give relevant research search results. It's actually about generating new texts, and those texts may be in a verbal form. So we have packages like, well, the most famous ChatGPT, Bard, Bing AI, what are sometimes called large language models, that are generating new text on the basis of predictions based on existing texts. And that is also as well multimodal, visual, audiovisual. So packages like Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, these are packages that are used to generate new images or new videos in some cases, again, based on extracting and analyzing existing data, and then on the basis of that, predicting future and generating future kinds of data. So two waves of AI, and mainly what I'm focusing on here is the second of those. I think a key point, an obvious one, is that this is big business. In a way, this is the latest stage of what people call digital capitalism or platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism. It's a model that depends not just on selling us goods or services, but also on tracking our every move. Every click, every keystroke is used to gather data about us, and then to analyze and to sell that data in order to target us more effectively. That's how Google works. That's how Facebook works. That's how Amazon works. So we have seemingly free services that are offered to us, but they are offered to us in exchange for our data. This is the business model of the latest stage of digital capitalism. As they say, if the service seems to be free, then we are the product. And there are massive amounts of money involved in all of this. ChatGPT has been the fastest selling piece of software ever. It has over 100 million users. These figures are probably already well out of date. Just very recently, I think the last couple of months, we've seen what's effectively been the sale of OpenAI, which is the company that produces ChatGPT. And we've seen a steady shift. It's really across the history of digital technology, from companies that are set up in a quite public-spirited way to conduct research and development. And those companies gradually get taken over for the purpose of private profit. It's actually necessary because of the scale of what AI is doing. The gathering of all of that data requires them to work with big technology companies. So OpenAI, DeepMind, these are the key companies involved in research in AI. You know, they're owned by Microsoft and Google. The big tech companies, the 4 or 5 big technology companies, are really now dominating this market. Having said that, I think it's important to say that this is not necessarily a guaranteed business. There are ups and downs. It's possible that at the moment AI may be massively overvalued in the market. I think just recently, a couple of months ago, the biggest technology companies just lost $800 billion in market valuation, because even though there's masses of talk about AI, there are many, many users. Many of those users are getting the service extremely cheaply or for free. And many of these companies have yet to generate any profit. So there's a danger of another version of the dot-com bubble, where everybody's expectations are vastly inflated. I think the other thing to say here is that this business depends upon invisible human labor. It's not just the machines that are doing the work. There are people often in impoverished countries in the global south who are training the data in sweatshops. You know, they're annotating the data, they're training the software in very difficult working circumstances. So some problems, I think, coming from the business end of things. I think also some bigger social and environmental issues. This approach really begins with a kind of idealism. As I've said, the pioneers of ed tech are always looking to do good to humanity. But we have a model here that is basically premised on the harvesting of our data. It gathers our data and analyzes it and sells us things back to us. And that raises then very big questions about surveillance, about privacy. Our every move online is being observed and recorded, and the data is then being sold. And that has potentially big issues. You know, what is going on there? People often look to China's social credit system as a really dangerous future possibility. But actually, we have versions of that in many countries. The use of what is called predictive analytics, that is, the use of data about us that is then used to predict our future behavior. And it's often used in quite biased and unequal ways. It's used to stigmatize particular and police particular communities who are seen to be dangerous. So there is always a dimension there to do with class and to do with race, where particular dangerous communities are being more intensively surveilled. The other big issue, which is here in my picture, is to do with the environmental impact. So these technologies are massively hungry, greedy for energy. Some of the statistics here are extraordinary. We often talk about cloud computing, but actually the computers are not in the cloud. They're in big data centers, enormous data centers. I think I've seen a figure that Microsoft is currently spending something like $100 billion a year on building data centers. And the day-to-day running of an average data center will use the same amount of electricity as something like 80,000 households. And there's also water that is needed to cool the computers. I've heard, again, a statistic, a typical dialogue on ChatGPT will use 0.5 liter of water. And if you think about that in terms of the hundreds of thousands of dialogues on ChatGPT, it's clear that this is consuming vast amounts of energy. Although in a world where actually lots of people don't even have access to electricity or clean water. So there is an issue here about the use of energy and the implications of that in terms of climate change. Okay, big issues then, I think, also in terms of media and information. Lots of concern at the moment. I won't talk too much about this, but within the media industries about, will AI take our jobs? I think there will be many areas of media work, of employment in the media industries that will disappear, that will be done by technology. Many craft skills are likely to be redundant, and many people will be redundant. There will be a need for new skills, but there is going to be a process of restructuring of work within the media industries that will be quite painful for many people. There's also an issue, I think, within the media industries of copyright. The packages are out there gathering data, and this is data that human beings have created. It's human beings' creative work. It's their intellectual property. And yet typically we're not asked, we're not even informed about whether this is something we want to happen. The data is effectively being stolen from creative media producers. Other problems, I think, to do with the quality of the information we get. There's an old computer scientist's joke, which is garbage in, garbage out. You know, if the data that goes into the computer is rubbish, then what comes out will be rubbish. And there are many, many stories, if you read about this or if you're familiar with it, about the biases, the kinds of misinformation that emerge from AI because the data that's going in is not very useful. These things are often called hallucinations. I mean, basically, AI makes mistakes. It generates nonsense. It's not very good at sort of common sense thinking. It doesn't necessarily have built-in morality, built-in values. It just predicts on the basis of this automated process. And then following from that, there are new risks emerging. The possibility that bots will get better and better at impersonating human beings. It will become very difficult to tell the difference between a bot and a human. And also deep fakes are getting better and better all the time, often very difficult to tell the difference between an audio or a visual deep fake and an original recording. Following from that, some educational issues here. I think at the moment we've got rather stuck with AI, with the educational discussion about AI in a debate about cheating. You know, if students have access to this technology, will they just use it to write their essays for them, to cheat? And there is then a discussion about possible solutions. You know, can we build in a detector into the software? Can we find ways of watermarking students' essays so that teachers will be able to tell if they've been written with AI? Some teachers are now turning back to older forms of assessment. You will sit down and write with a pen, or oral assessment, because computer-based assessment is seen to be less reliable. Actually, I think there are bigger questions at stake here, really. I think the advent of AI raises some big questions about the status of knowledge here. You know, what are we doing, you know, in education? Are we just giving students access to predetermined forms of knowledge? Or are we hopefully encouraging them to think more critically about how knowledge is produced? The other dimension to this is that education is, of course, a lucrative market, and the history of technology in education is very much about tech companies, entrepreneurs finding new markets and looking to schools as a potentially lucrative market. But in this context, it's not just about selling them bits of kit, bits of equipment, bits of software. The fact that the technology can be used to gather data, raises, I think, some very big questions about privacy in schools. What right do students have in schools when their every move online is being recorded, and often the school is in a deal with the technology provider to then provide that data? So in a sense, what's going on is another move, a further move in the privatization of public education. And as I've said, although robot teachers are possibly quite a long way away, we may have AI assistants, as in this picture, but there is a danger that certain skills and competencies that teachers have may well be lost. This may be part of a broader de-skilling of the teaching profession that I think is going on, certainly in this country. So that was the bad news. Now I want to suggest some possible alternatives here, and to talk in particular about what media education might do in response. In a way, I think the key issue here to address is the issue of transparency. We have a technology that is taking data, it's feeding on our data. It's not necessarily being transparent about where that data is coming from. In a sense, the technology works in a kind of black box, and it's very hard for us to know how it's working and also how the business is working. So I think this issue of transparency is a key one for media education. So we need to find ways of identifying the sources of information, of where this information is coming from. We need to be understanding how the algorithms work, how the technology actually works. We need a kind of commercial transparency. Now, I think a lot of this is actually about regulation. I don't think education is necessarily going to be the answer to all of these problems. There are certain things that will only happen when the technology is properly regulated, and that is an issue for communications policy, not so much for education. But education, I think, can play a part in making some of this this hidden stuff that's going on, in making it visible, in making it transparent. And that, in a way, I would say, is part of informed citizenship. It's part of being a citizen in a world that is increasingly permeated by technology, where technology is everywhere. That means a critical function for media education. I'm not talking about educational technology here in the old sense. I'm not talking about the technical or functional use of technology. I'm talking about asking critical questions. But I think it's important to say being critical is not the same thing as being cynical. We don't want to get to a position where nobody trusts anything and it's all lies. And that's a very tempting position to get into. This is an argument that I made in that book you can see there, which is actually translated into Korean. Thank you very much. The Media Education Manifesto. And in that book, that's about 5 years old now, I was really trying to say, look, how do we take media education and apply it to social media? And I want to suggest here that we can do a similar move. We can take some key principles of media education and apply those to AI as well. So this is about questioning the tools that you're using as a teacher. And you don't need to be a computer scientist to do this. We can all do this. You'll be familiar, I hope, with these as the key concepts in the UK, but I think in other countries as well. These 4 key concepts. Sometimes there are 3, sometimes there are 5, but this should be a familiar model. Production, media language, representation, audience. These are the critical concepts that we're using to teach and to analyze media. So questions about who makes AI and why, questions about how meanings are being created here, questions about how AI texts represent the world, how do we evaluate that, and questions about how AI as a tool is being used. These are concepts, I think, that can apply to AI. In my manifesto, I took those concepts and applied them to social media. Here, I think we can begin to see, and I'm still thinking about this, and I'm hoping that other people are thinking too, about ways of taking that conceptual framework and applying it. So let's think about production. So we're looking at how media are produced and sold here. So this is really about the political economy of media. It's about teaching about the history of media, about the business, about the economics and how the industry works. So it's about alerting students to what is going on in the industry. You know, how does ChatGPT even exist in the first place? Who makes it? How do they come to make it? It costs a lot of money to make it. Where does that money come from? It generates profit. So where does the money go to? Who's in charge here? And how is that business developing and changing? How are the technologies marketed to us? What kinds of claims are being made as people are trying to sell us this stuff? Who owns a company like OpenAI or DeepMind? Why would it be that Microsoft or Google in those two cases, you know, what is their interest in this market? So I think some critical questions then about what's going on in the business of AI, and also some questions about regulation. Should this business be regulated by government? And in what ways? What needs regulation and how is regulation going to happen? Second key concept was media language. So here we're looking at the question of how media create meaning. I would say that AI is not so much a medium, but it's a tool. It's a tool that we can use to manipulate media of various kinds, including, as I've said, verbal, but also visual and audiovisual media. And the question is, well, you know, what's going on here? And I think there is a possibility here for a kind of experimentation, a kind of play, really, to go on. You can have a dialogue with something like ChatGPT. You can give it some instructions, and you can then refine those instructions, and you will get very different results from that. And one thing that one can do as a teacher is then to look at those results. Different groups of students in your class will get different results. You know, why? How does a changing a particular word here give us a different visual image, for example? Here we have, I found this online. This is from a package called Midjourney, which is one of the main visual AI packages. The instruction was a captain standing on a cliff looking at a lighthouse. And what you've got is some very different images. And in terms of semiotics, in terms of how those images create meaning or how we create meaning from those images, they're really quite different. You can see that the perspective is different. The relation between the foreground and the background is different. The actual nature of, in this case, the lighthouse is different. So experimentation with the software may well give us very different results that are interesting to talk about and to compare. And in a sense, what we're doing here as we play with the prompts that we give the software, we're exposing the algorithm. If we change a word here, the algorithm assumes that we're talking about something different. So this is a way of beginning to make the algorithm, the thing that's in that black box, more visible, to make the black box more transparent. And then representation and audience. So when we're teaching about representation, how do people use this tool to represent the world? So these big questions about trust, veracity, reliability, the questions about information, misinformation, what is going on here, and how far can we trust what it is that we're seeing? As I've said, one possibility is to give the software different kinds of prompts and to evaluate the results. You put a prompt in, you get things back. How useful are those results? And I think it's almost certain, certainly at the moment, that some of what you get back will be, as I said, nonsense. So, why is that happening? And how do we evaluate it? One thing that I think is really useful to do here is to do, again, it's a very traditional thing, a production simulation. So we imagine that we are using AI to produce a piece of media, to produce, an advertising campaign or something small scale, a music video, a newspaper front page. So I'm talking old media here, but we're using AI to remake these old media. And what happens then when we say, well, look, we want a different product here, we want a different audience, we want a different market, a different medium. How does that change what you get? So changing the prompts to change the audience, to change the kind of representation we get, to change the context of the media that we're producing, I think can be a very useful way of teaching about these key concepts, particularly about audience and the relation between production and audience. I think a big question, and I put a question mark here, is whether this is all about a new kind of creativity. I think there's a way in which the results we can get from AI are often of very high quality. They often look better than the kinds of things that students would have produced in the classroom using old media. And what can also happen is that previously hidden parts of the process can be made more visible. So things like editing, things like design, that might have been sort of locked away can be made visible and made apparent by allowing us this kind of play with the resources and play with the software. Complex editing that would be quite hard in another way, or special effects can be made visible and then possible to think about. So what we're doing very often here is kind of reusing, remixing, reworking existing media. And I guess the question is, is this creativity? Is it just prompt engineering, as it's called, or is it really a form of creativity? I have to say that the most interesting creative stuff that I've seen that comes out of this world is more what I would call creative technology than just AI. People doing creative work using technology, maybe using AI, but actually they're very often using older media as well. So they may be using, drawing and painting even, but they're using AI to then play with that and change that around. So I think a question here about how far this really is creative. I think the most interesting stuff is often mixed media. And I would insist in my familiar way that, we don't just need creativity, we also need to think about the results in a critical kind of way. Okay, magically, I'm coming to the end, which is good. Because I've done 40 minutes. So I'm just going to finish with a few questions. I mean, the obvious thing is that, I'm talking about something, it's November 2024. In a year's time, in 2 years' time, this will be very, very different. This is a quickly moving target. So, and this is just a moment in the evolution of all of this. As I said, the pioneers of AI really wanted to use AI for social good. I mean, it seems almost old-fashioned these days, but could we think of ways of using AI not just for commercial profit, but for social good? And what would that social good be like? How are we to regulate AI? And I think there are big moves afoot, particularly in Europe. The European Union has been quite forward-looking in its regulation of AI. So we have a new AI Act, which is going to regulate the technology. But of course, there is often a big gap between what the law says and what actually happens in practice. So regulation is one thing, but actually implementing regulation is another. Inevitably, we are going to have to find ways of working with AI. The genie is out of the bottle. AI is here. It's not going to go away. In some form, it's actually already been around for a long time. So the question is for teachers and for all of us, how do we work with AI? I think there are good reasons for resisting AI, but the reality is we will have to find ways of working with it and using it critically and creatively. And I think both possibilities should be there, but the risk is that we will forget the critical questions that we need to ask. So there we are. Thank you for listening. I hope you're still there. I have no idea. Perhaps the hall is completely empty.
Thank you very much for your valuable presentation. And now we will open up the floor. 네, 발표 잘 들었습니다. 혹시 질문이나
Thank you very much. We will open up the floor for questions or maybe people to make comments about the thoughts and concerns that they have had. Raise your hand and we'll hand you the microphone.
Yes, the question from the back. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for that great and insightful presentation. I am a parent myself, and I'm also a media journalist myself. So that's who I am. And I think I've been interested in this topic for a very long time. So if you look at Africa or other developing countries like Southeast Asian countries, AI issue is not a big thing there, at least from what I see it. They're very vulnerable because the internet or technology, I think it's bringing the countries together closer. But with the AI, I think what's happening is it's actually making more distances from those countries depending on where they are. And there's a greater disparities and gap taking place. I mean, it's good if we share those great technologies. But like I mentioned, the developing countries are not exactly getting the same benefits from this amazing technology. So what do you think of education in those countries so that they can benefit?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting and important question. I think there is always one of the big unanticipated consequences will be to do with inequality in access to technology. So the pioneers, the companies are very keen to tell us that this technology will be everywhere, everybody will have access. But the reality is that is not what happens. I think at the moment also, it's important to say that a lot of the cost of the technology is kind of hidden. So we have very wealthy companies, Google, Microsoft, who are in a sense funding the development of the technology. The cost to us at the moment in wealthy countries is really quite small. You can buy a subscription to ChatGPT, for example. It costs you very little. Many of the technologies are available for nothing. And yet that cannot continue. because, as I said, these technologies are actually very costly. It's not just the cost of research and development that has gone into them, which is billions and billions of dollars, but also the cost in keeping them working, the costs in terms of energy. If those figures I mentioned about the use of electricity, the use of water are even half true, we're talking about technologies that are really, really expensive to use. And as I've said, that is pretty mad in a world where actually many people do not even have access to electricity or clean water. And to have technologies that depend upon those things is really then likely to be something that will only be possible for an elite. And I think there's maybe an interesting difference here between AI and mobile technology. I think, mobile phones in the global south are actually in many contexts really quite wide, they're used in quite widespread ways because they are relatively cheap, they are relatively inexpensive, obviously not to everybody. But here we're talking about the technology that is vastly expensive. Once we start paying the real price of AI, we will suddenly find that it's going to be, the price may well be prohibitive for many of us, let alone for people in developing countries. So I think that issue of disparity of access or inequality of access is going to, it's going to become an issue only a little further down the line. So a good point, good point.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we can accommodate one more. Any other questions from the floor or comments? If not, we will conclude
the presentation. We don't have more question here at the site. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. 네, 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수.
Thank you. Please give another big hand to Professor Buckingham. Through this special lecture, we were able to hear about the essence of and the future of media education in the age of AI. And that concludes the National Media Education Conference 2024. Despite your busyness, thank you for joining us from so early in the morning until late in the evening. We appreciate it very much. We are able to reflect on and share diverse cases and the future of media education. And we hope that this was a meaningful time for all of you. And once again, we will conclude the conference here. If you use the interpretation receiver, return it at the information desk. And don't forget your belongings as well. Please have a safe trip. Hope. Thank you very much.